Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach in 1878 Colorado Territory, clutching the letter that promised her a new husband and a fresh start, but Thomas Brennan was nowhere to be found, and in his abandoned cabin lay a baby with no one to care for him. She came west following one letter that brought her here, but now faced a choice that would define her life without any letter to guide her. The stagecoach hit another bump, and Clara Whitmore's head smacked against the wooden wall hard enough to make her ears ring. Through the dust-covered window, she could see mountains bigger than any building back in Chicago. The year was 1878, and she was heading to a town called Millbrook in Colorado Territory to marry a man she'd never met. "Last stop, lady," the driver yelled from up front. His voice was rough like sandpaper on wood. Clara's hands shook as she smoothed down her best blue dress. It wasn't much to look at after 3 days of travel, but it was all she had. In her coat pocket she felt the edges of Thomas Brennan's letter. He'd written such nice things about their future together, about the little house he was building, about how lonely he was without a wife. The stagecoach wheels made a grinding sound as they stopped. Clara grabbed her small bag and stepped down onto a wooden platform that creaked under her feet. The air smelled like pine trees and smoke from someone's fireplace. It was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She looked around for Thomas. He'd said he would be waiting right here at the station. He'd said he had brown hair and would wear his best hat. But the platform was almost empty. Just an old man reading a newspaper and a woman with 2 small children pulling at her skirt. "You getting back on or staying?" the driver asked. He was already pulling down her trunk from the back of the coach. "Staying," Clara said, though her voice sounded small. The stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of red dust. Clara stood alone on the platform, holding her bag tight against her chest. Where was Thomas? Had something happened to him? Maybe he was just late. The old man with the newspaper looked up at her. "You waiting for someone, miss?" "Thomas Brennan," Clara said. "Do you know him?" The man's face changed. He folded his newspaper slowly and stood up. "I'm afraid you missed him, miss. Tom left town about 3 weeks ago, packed up in the middle of the night, and took off." Clara felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. "Left? But we were supposed to get married today." "I'm real sorry," the man said. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to walk away but didn't know how. Tom owed money to half the people in town. Guess he decided to run instead of pay up. The woman with the children came over. Her name was Sarah, she said. She had kind eyes but worry lines around them. "You that mail-order bride Tom was always talking about?" Clara nodded. She felt like crying but held it back. "Well, you can't just stand here," Sarah said. "Come on, I'll show you to Tom's place. Maybe you can figure out what to do from there." They walked up the main street of Millbrook. It wasn't much of a town. There was a general store, a saloon, a tiny church, and maybe 20 houses scattered around. Mountains rose up on all sides like giant walls. Clara had never seen anything so big or felt so small. "Tom lived in a cabin just outside town," Sarah explained as they walked. "Worked a mining claim that never paid much. Always had big dreams, though. Always talking about striking it rich." Clara tried to think. She had spent almost all her money on the train ticket west. She had nowhere to go and no family to take her in. Her parents were dead, and she'd quit her job at the factory to come here. "What am I going to do?" she asked, more to herself than to Sarah. "I don't know, honey," Sarah said. "But first things first, you need to see what Tom left behind." They turned off the main street onto a narrow path that led into the trees. Clara's trunk bumped along behind them as Sarah's husband pulled it on a wooden cart. The air got cooler under the pine trees. and Clara could hear a creak somewhere nearby. "There it is," Sarah said, pointing ahead. The cabin was small and looked like it hadn't been painted in years. The windows were dirty, and weeds grew up around the front steps. It looked lonely sitting there among the trees. Sarah pushed open the front door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the cabin was dim and smelled like old tobacco and something else Clara couldn't name. There was one room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace. Clothes were scattered on the floor like Thomas had left in a hurry. "He took most of his things," Sarah said, looking around. "But there's something else you need to know about." Clara was looking at the clothes on the floor when she heard it. A tiny sound from the corner of the room, like a kitten mewing. But it wasn't a kitten. In the corner, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, was a baby. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the tiny face peeking out from the old blanket. The baby had dark hair and the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. He looked up at her without crying, just watching her with a serious expression that seemed too old for such a little face. "Whose baby is this?" Clara whispered. Sarah shifted uncomfortably by the door. "That's what Tom never told you in his letters, I guess. The baby's his. His name is Samuel." "Thomas has a son?" Clara felt dizzy. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Had a woman living with him last year," Sarah explained. "She died, giving birth to the baby. Fever took her 3 days later. Tom tried to care for the little one, but he wasn't much good at it, always leaving Samuel with neighbors when he went to work his claim." Clara knelt down beside the makeshift crib. It was just a wooden box with blankets inside. The baby reached up with one tiny hand, and without thinking, Clara let him grab her finger. His grip was surprisingly strong. "When Tom ran off, he just left Samuel here," Sarah continued. "I've been coming by twice a day to feed him and check on him, but I've got 4 children of my own and another one coming. I can't keep doing it much longer." "How old is he?" Clara asked. The baby was still holding her finger, and she found she didn't want to pull away. "About 6 months, I think. Maybe 7. He was so small when he was born, it's hard to tell." Clara looked around the shabby cabin. There were empty bottles on the table and dirty dishes in a wooden bowl, mouse droppings in the corners. This was no place for a baby. "What happens to him now?" she asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Well, there's an orphanage in Denver. Takes about 2 days to get there by stagecoach. Or maybe someone in town might take him in, though most folks already have their hands full." An orphanage. Clara had grown up in one back in Chicago. She remembered the long rows of beds, the thin soup, the way the older children picked on the smaller ones, the way no one ever had enough of anything, especially love. Samuel made a small sound and smiled at her. Actually smiled, like he knew her. "He's hungry," Sarah said. "I brought some milk with me." She pulled a bottle from her bag and handed it to Clara. "You want to feed him?" Clara had never fed a baby before, but it seemed natural somehow. Samuel drank eagerly, his little hands pressed against the bottle. When he was done, he fell asleep in her arms, his head heavy against her shoulder. "What was she like?" Clara asked quietly. "His mother. Pretty girl, quiet. She was running from something back east, I think. Never talked much about her past. Tom met her in the saloon, but she wasn't working there or anything like that. Just passing through and got stuck when winter came early." Clara looked down at Samuel's sleeping face. He looked peaceful now, fed and warm. But what would happen to him when she left? Because she would have to leave, wouldn't she? She had no money, no husband, no way to take care of a baby. "I should go," Clara said. But she didn't move. "Where will you go?" Sarah asked gently. That was the question Clara had been trying not to think about. "I don't know. Maybe I can find work in town until I save enough money to get back east. Doing what? There's not much work for women here except washing clothes or working in the saloon, and you don't look like the saloon type. Clara knew Sarah was right. She looked down at Samuel again. He had such long eyelashes. His little chest rose and fell with each breath. I could write to my sister in Kansas, Clara said, though she wasn't sure her sister would help. They hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not since Clara had refused to marry the man her sister had picked out for her. That might work, Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, Clara could hear birds singing and the sound of the creek. It was peaceful here, despite everything. What if I stayed? Clara said suddenly. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Sarah. Here, in Tom's cabin? Someone needs to take care of Samuel, and I need somewhere to live. Clara looked around the cabin again. It was small and run down, but it had good bones. With some cleaning and fixing up, it could be a real home. Clara, honey, that's a big decision. You don't know anything about taking care of a baby, and winter's coming. It gets cold up here, colder than anything you've known back east. I can learn, Clara said. About babies, I mean, and I'm not afraid of cold. But even as she said it, Clara wondered if she was making a huge mistake. What did she know about babies? What did she know about living alone in the wilderness? Samuel stirred in her arms and opened his eyes. Those blue eyes looked right at her, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't even known was closed. I'll stay, she said, and this time her voice was steady, at least for a while, until I figure out what else to do. Sarah smiled for the first time since Clara had met her. Well, if you're sure, I can help you get started. Bring you some supplies, show you how to heat milk for the baby. My husband can help fix up the cabin some. Clara looked down at Samuel again. Did you hear that, little one? Looks like you're stuck with me for now. But as she said it, Clara realized something surprising. She wasn't just staying to help Samuel. Part of her wanted to stay. For the first time in her life, she felt like she might be needed. Really needed. Not just as a wife or a factory worker or someone to fill an empty space, but as someone who could make a real difference. Samuel yawned and closed his eyes again, perfectly content in her arms. Maybe this wasn't the new life Clara had planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the new life she was meant to have. The stranger's horse was the finest animal Clara had ever seen. Its black coat shined like polished metal as it walked up the dirt path to her cabin. Clara wiped flour from her hands and stepped outside, her heart beating fast. Nobody rode horses like that in Millbrook. This visitor meant trouble. Are you the woman caring for my brother's child? The voice was sharp and cold as winter ice. Clara looked up at the rider and felt her world tilt sideways. The woman had Samuel's exact same blue eyes and dark hair. She sat straight in her fancy saddle, wearing clothes that cost more than Clara made in a year. Gold buttons caught the morning sunlight. Her boots were real leather, not the worn cloth ones Clara had patched 3 times. I'm Margaret Brennan, the woman said, stepping down from her horse like she owned the whole mountain. Thomas was my brother. Inside the cabin, Samuel started crying. Clara's hands shook as she heard his voice. This beautiful, rich woman wanted to take him away. Clara could see it in those cold blue eyes. Your brother left Samuel here, Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. He's been my boy for 8 months now. Margaret laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Your boy? You're nobody to him. The words hit Clara like a slap. She thought of all the nights she'd walked the floor with Samuel when he was sick, all the times she'd sung him to sleep. All the money she'd spent on milk and medicine instead of food for herself. "Samuel knows me," Clara said quietly. "I'm the only mother he remembers." "That doesn't matter." Margaret opened a leather bag and pulled out official-looking papers. "These say I'm his legal family, his real family. I'm taking him back to Boston, where he belongs." Clara's legs felt weak. She sat down hard on the wooden step. "You can't just take him." "Watch me." Margaret folded the papers and put them away. "I have money, lawyers, a big house with servants. I can give him everything you never could." Through the cabin door, Clara could hear Samuel's cries getting louder. He wanted her. He needed her. But what could she do against papers and lawyers and money? "He's happy here," Clara tried again. "The doctor says he's healthy. He's learning to walk. He laughs when I sing to him. He'll learn to laugh at better things than poor people's songs." Margaret looked around at the small cabin, the patched roof, the tiny garden. Her nose wrinkled like she smelled something bad. "Look at this place. No child should live like this." Clara felt anger rising in her chest like fire. This place is full of love. That matters more than fancy things. Love doesn't pay for doctors when children get sick. Love doesn't buy warm clothes for winter. Love doesn't send children to good schools. Margaret's voice got harder. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning on the stagecoach. The boy comes with me." Clara stood up so fast she almost fell over. "His name is Samuel, and he stays with me. We'll see about that." Margaret got back on her horse. "If you try to run away with him, I'll have the sheriff after you. I know people in Denver. Important people. You can't hide from me." Clara watched the fancy horse carry Margaret back toward town. Inside the cabin, Samuel's crying got worse. She went to him and picked him up. "What am I going to do, little one?" she whispered into his soft hair. "How can I fight someone like that?" Samuel looked up at her with those blue eyes, Thomas's eyes, Margaret's eyes, but filled with trust that belonged only to Clara. He reached up and touched her face with his tiny hand. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She walked around the cabin holding Samuel, thinking hard. Margaret had money and papers and the law on her side. All Clara had was love. But what if love wasn't enough? She looked at her mother's silver locket on the table. It was the only valuable thing she owned. Maybe she could sell it, get money for a lawyer. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. No judge would choose a poor woman over a rich relative. As the sun came up, Clara made a decision that scared her more than anything she'd ever done. She packed Samuel's things in a small bag. If she couldn't fight Margaret in court, maybe she could disappear into the mountains. There were places to hide in Colorado Territory, places where fancy ladies from Boston would never find them. But just as she reached for the door handle, she smelled something that changed everything. Smoke filled the morning air like a gray blanket. Clara ran outside with Samuel in her arms and saw orange flames dancing on the roof of Henderson's General Store. The fire was spreading fast, jumping from building to building like a hungry animal. "Fire! Fire!" People ran everywhere, shouting and carrying buckets. Men climbed ladders to throw water on the flames. Women grabbed their children and ran to safety. The whole town looked like a kicked anthill. Clara started running toward the bucket line, but Sarah Mitchell grabbed her arm. "You can't help with the baby," Sarah said. "Stay back where it's safe." But Clara couldn't just watch. The general store was where she bought Samuel's milk. Mr. Henderson had been kind to her when other people whispered mean things. She handed Samuel to Sarah and ran toward the fire. The heat hit her face like opening an oven door. Smoke made her eyes water and her throat burn. She grabbed a bucket from someone and joined the line of people passing water from the well to the fire. Her arms ached from the heavy buckets, but she kept going. That's when she saw Margaret. The fancy lady from Boston stood in the bucket line, too, her expensive dress already dirty with soot and water. Her perfect hair hung loose around her face. She looked nothing like the cold woman who had threatened Clara yesterday. "The schoolhouse!" someone screamed. Clara turned and saw the worst thing possible. Sparks from the general store had jumped to the little school building. But that wasn't the terrible part. The terrible part was the 3 children she could see through the window, trapped inside as smoke poured through the cracks. Without thinking, Clara dropped her bucket and ran toward the burning school. She could hear Margaret's footsteps right behind her. "You take the door? I'll try the window," Margaret shouted over the noise of the fire. Clara kicked at the wooden door. It was stuck tight, swollen from the heat. Margaret appeared beside her with a rock and smashed the window glass. Together, they crawled through the broken window into the smoky room. Inside, Clara couldn't see anything. The smoke was so thick it was like being blind. She got down on her hands and knees where the air was a little clearer and crawled forward. "Here!" Margaret's voice came from the corner. "I found them!" Clara crawled toward the sound and felt small bodies huddled together. 2 little girls and a boy, all crying and coughing. The other girl was big enough to crawl between them. Getting out was harder than getting in. The window seemed much higher from inside. Clara had to push the little girl up through the broken glass, being careful not to let her get cut. Margaret lifted the boy up to waiting hands outside. The older girl went last, brave and quiet, even though Clara could see she was scared. When Clara finally crawled out of the burning building, her lungs felt like they were on fire. She coughed so hard she couldn't stand up straight. Margaret collapsed beside her, gasping for air. "Are they okay?" Clara asked, when she could finally talk. Dr. Mackenzie was checking the children. "They'll be fine," he called out. "Thanks to you two." Clara looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time. The rich woman's face was black with soot. Her expensive dress was torn and dirty. Her hands were bleeding from the broken glass. But her blue eyes, Samuel's eyes, were different now, softer somehow. "Why did you help me?" Clara asked. Margaret was quiet for a long time, watching Dr. Mackenzie care for the children they'd saved. "I came here thinking you were just some woman who wanted my nephew for the wrong reasons," she said finally. "But you ran into a burning building to save children who weren't even yours." Clara wiped soot from her face. "That's what you do when children need help. You help them." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I see that now." They sat together in the dirt, watching the firefighters finally get the flames under control. The general store was gone, but they'd saved the rest of the buildings. Most importantly, they'd saved the children. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said. "Thomas wrote me a letter before he left town. He said he was ashamed of leaving Samuel. He said he'd left his baby with just some mail-order bride who probably didn't really care about him." Clara's heart sank. Even Thomas had thought she was nobody special. "But he was wrong," Margaret continued. "You're not just anything. You're Samuel's mother, the only mother he's ever known. And watching you today, seeing how this whole town trusts you, how you put yourself in danger for other people's children." She paused. "I think my brother was a fool to leave you both." Clara felt tears mixing with the soot on her face. "Does this mean?" "It means Samuel belongs with you," Margaret said. "But Clara, I have money, resources. I could help you both if you'd let me. Make sure you never have to worry about doctors or warm clothes or good food." Clara thought about the fancy horse, the expensive clothes, the big house in Boston that Margaret had described. Are you asking me to come to Boston? No. Margaret smiled, and for the first time, she looked kind. I'm asking if I can stay here sometimes. If I can be Samuel's aunt, and maybe. As if he knew they were talking about him, Samuel's cry came from across the crowd. Sarah was walking toward them, carrying the baby who was reaching his little arms toward Clara. Clara took Samuel and held him close. He smelled like smoke now, but he was safe. What would she say to this woman who could have taken everything, but chose to give instead? Margaret Brennan's horse kicked up dust clouds as she rode away from town, but Clara knew she would return. The wealthy woman from Boston had made her intentions clear. She wanted Samuel, and she had the law on her side. Clara sat on her cabin steps, watching Samuel crawl through the dirt, chasing a butterfly with the pure joy that only babies possess. In 3 hours, Margaret would be back with papers from the territorial judge in Denver. Miss Clara? Sarah Mitchell appeared around the corner of the cabin, her face pale with worry. There's talk in town. Some folks saying Margaret Brennan has every right to take that baby. Others saying you've earned your place as his mama. Clara's stomach twisted. She knew which side held more power. What do you think, Sarah? I think blood ain't the only thing that makes family. Sarah sat down beside her. But thinking something and proving it in court are two different things. The sound of approaching horses made both women tense. Margaret returned with 2 men, one wearing a badge, the other carrying a leather satchel that screamed lawyer. Behind them rode Dr. Mackenzie, his weathered face grim. Mrs. Whitmore, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. I'm Sheriff Reynolds. This here's Mr. Hartwell, the territorial judge's representative. We need to discuss the matter of the child. Clara stood slowly, her legs feeling weak. Samuel is taking his afternoon nap. That's fine, Mr. Hartwell said, opening his satchel. We can conduct this discussion quietly. He pulled out several papers. Miss Brennan has presented compelling evidence of her legal claim to the child. As the deceased father's sister, she has legitimate family rights. What about my rights? Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. I've cared for Samuel for 8 months. Fed him when he was hungry, held him when he cried, nursed him through sickness. You've done admirable work, Margaret said, and Clara heard genuine respect in her voice. But Samuel needs stability, education, opportunities I can provide in Boston. Dr. Mackenzie stepped forward. Now hold on just a minute. His Scottish accent thickened when he was angry. I've been doctoring in these mountains for 20 years, and I've seen plenty of children. That boy in there is thriving under Clara's care. His weight is good, his development normal, his temperament happy. You can't argue with results like that. No one questions Miss Whitmore's care, the lawyer said smoothly. But the law is clear about family relationships. Then let's talk about family, said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Reverend Patterson approaching, his black coat dusty from a hard ride. I've been visiting the mining camps, but I heard about this situation and rode back as fast as I could. Clara's heart sank. The Reverend had never approved of her unmarried status. But his next words surprised her. I've been thinking about family since I left town, about what makes someone a parent. Is it the act of birth, the sharing of blood? Or is it the daily choice to love, protect, and sacrifice for a child? He walked closer to the group. I baptized Samuel 2 months ago. Clara stood before God and made promises to raise that boy in faith and love. She didn't make those promises lightly, and she hasn't broken them. Margaret's face showed confusion and something that might have been pain. You don't understand. Thomas was my younger brother. When our parents died, I raised him. I failed him somehow, or he wouldn't have ended up here, abandoning his child. I thought I thought I could make up for that failure by giving Samuel everything Thomas never had. What Thomas never had wasn't money or fancy schools, Clara said quietly. It was someone who chose to stay. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret's composed mask cracked, and Clara saw the grief underneath. I loved Thomas, Margaret whispered, but I was 18 when our parents died. I tried to be his mother and his sister, and I wasn't good at either. When he left Boston, I told myself it was for the best, that he needed to find his own way. Her voice broke. I never wrote, never visited. When I got word he was dead, I realized I'd already lost him years ago. Sheriff Reynolds cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ma'am, we still need to settle the legal matter. But something had shifted in the circle of adults. Dr. Mackenzie put his weathered hand on Margaret's shoulder. Grief makes us all do things that don't make sense. But taking that boy from the only mother he's known won't bring Thomas back. What if? Margaret's voice was barely audible. What if I stayed? For a while? Got to know Samuel and Clara too? The lawyer looked frustrated. Miss Brennan, you have legal rights that don't require compromise. Maybe some things are more important than legal rights, Margaret said, looking directly at Clara. Maybe some families are chosen rather than born. Clara felt hope flutter in her chest like Samuel's butterfly. You'd want to stay? Here? I could rent a house in town, visit regularly, help with expenses. Margaret's words came faster now, as if she was afraid to stop. Samuel should know about Thomas, the good parts of him. And maybe I could learn what it really means to be family. Sarah Mitchell grinned. Now that sounds like sense talking. The lawyer snapped his satchel shut with obvious irritation. This is highly irregular. So was a mail-order bride becoming a mother to an abandoned baby, Clara said. But irregular doesn't mean wrong. Sheriff Reynolds pushed his hat back. Seems to me like you folks have worked this out yourselves. Don't need a judge for that. As the men prepared to leave, Margaret lingered. Clara, I owe you an apology. I came here thinking you were just some desperate woman who'd grabbed onto the first thing that looked like security. I was wrong. What changed your mind? Margaret smiled, and for the first time, Clara saw warmth in those blue eyes, so like Samuel's. Yesterday, during the fire, you handed your baby to a stranger so you could run into a burning building to save children you'd never met. That's not desperation. That's courage. From inside the cabin came the sound of Samuel waking from his nap, a soft babbling that made both women smile. Come on, Clara said. Let's go wake up your nephew properly. Spring had painted the Colorado mountains in shades of green Clara never knew existed, and Samuel's laughter echoed across the meadow behind their expanded cabin. At 2 years old, he toddled after Margaret with the determination of a miner chasing gold, his chubby hands reaching for the wildflowers she gathered. Aunt Maggie! Aunt Maggie! He called, the words clear and sweet in the mountain air. Clara smiled as she hung laundry on the line Margaret had helped her string between 2 pine trees. The sight of her son, for that's what Samuel truly was now, playing with his aunt, filled her with a contentment she'd never imagined possible back in Chicago's smoky factories. Clara! Sarah Mitchell's voice carried across the distance. She was walking up the path with her youngest daughter, Emma, skipping beside her. Got news from town! News in Millbrook usually meant one of 3 things. Someone struck silver, someone got married, or someone died. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and waited. The territorial government's sending a new teacher for the school, Sarah announced, slightly out of breath from the uphill walk. A young man from Denver. Says he wants to start classes for the little ones too, not just the older children. Clara's heart jumped. She'd been teaching Samuel his letters and numbers herself, but the idea of proper schooling excited her. When does he arrive? Next week. Margaret's been asking around town about it. Seems she's mighty interested in what kind of education Samuel will get. As if summoned by her name, Margaret appeared from behind the cabin, Samuel riding on her shoulders like a tiny king. The proper Boston lady who'd arrived 6 months ago had transformed into someone Clara barely recognized. Her expensive dresses had been replaced by practical skirts and boots. Her pale hands were now strong and sun-browned from helping with garden work and cabin repairs. "Did I hear talk about the new teacher?" Margaret asked, lifting Samuel down carefully. "His name's William Harper," Sarah said. "Fresh from Teachers College. Word is he's got new ideas about teaching children." "Mama, look!" Samuel held up a handful of crushed dandelions, his face beaming with pride at his gift. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Clara said, accepting the wilted flowers as if they were precious jewels. "Should we put them in water?" As they walked toward the cabin, Margaret fell into step beside Clara. This easy companionship had developed slowly over the winter months. Margaret had rented the small house behind the general store, visiting daily and gradually becoming part of Samuel's routine. More than that, she'd become Clara's friend, something neither woman had expected. "I received a letter from Boston yesterday," Margaret said quietly. Clara's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually Margaret's old life would call her back. "My business partner wants me to return. There are contracts to sign, decisions to make." Margaret paused. "The company is doing well, but it needs attention." They'd reached the cabin porch. Samuel immediately began climbing the steps, chattering to himself about flowers and butterflies. Clara sat down heavily on the wooden step, feeling suddenly tired. "When will you leave?" "That's what I wanted to discuss with you." Margaret sat beside her, their shoulders touching in comfortable friendship. "I've been thinking about selling my share of the business." Clara stared at her. "Selling? But it's your inheritance, your security." "My security is here now," Margaret said simply. "With Samuel. With you. I never expected to find family again, Clara, but that's what's happened." "But your whole life is in Boston." Margaret laughed, but it wasn't bitter. "My whole life was work and loneliness, and trying to prove I was as smart as the men who wanted to run my business into the ground. Here, I wake up excited to see what Samuel will learn today, or whether your tomatoes will finally ripen, or if Mrs. Henderson will finally admit she needs spectacles to read her Bible." "It's not always this peaceful," Clara warned. "Winter was hard. There'll be sickness, accidents, bad weather. This isn't Boston society." "Thank goodness for that," Margaret said firmly. "I tried Boston society. It left me empty." Samuel tottered over with a stick he'd found, offering it to Clara with the same seriousness he'd shown with the flowers. She accepted it solemnly, making him giggle. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "I've been talking to Dr. Mackenzie about the medical supplies the town needs, and to Reverend Patterson about improvements to the school. I have money sitting in banks doing nothing when it could be helping people here." Clara felt overwhelmed. "Margaret, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Margaret's voice was firm but gentle. "Thomas ran away from responsibility. I spent years running toward it but never finding anything worth being responsible for. Now I have Samuel, and you and this whole community. I want to invest in all of it. What about when Samuel grows up? When he wants to see the world beyond these mountains?" Margaret smiled. "Then we'll make sure he's educated enough and confident enough to go anywhere he chooses. But we'll also make sure he knows he has a home to come back to." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. A young man rode up the path, tall, thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles and clothes that marked him as the new teacher Sarah had mentioned. "Afternoon, ladies," he called, dismounting with careful movements that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable on horseback. "I'm William Harper, the new schoolmaster. I'm visiting families with children to introduce myself." Clara stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm Clara Whitmore, and this is Margaret Brennan. This young man is Samuel." Samuel, never shy, walked directly to the stranger and offered him the stick he'd been carrying. William accepted it with appropriate gravity. "A fine stick, Samuel. Is this your home?" "Mama Clara and Aunt Maggie," Samuel announced proudly. William's eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile remained warm. "I see. Well, Samuel, would you like to learn letters and numbers with the other children?" "He already knows some," Clara said quickly. "I've been teaching him." "Excellent. A head start is always helpful." William turned his attention to Margaret. "Miss Brennan, I understand you're from Boston." "Some," Margaret replied carefully. "I'm interested in what opportunities will be available for the children here." "That's actually why I wanted to speak with families individually," William said, his enthusiasm evident. "I believe education should be available to all children, regardless of their circumstances. I've heard some remarkable stories about this young man's family, and I want to ensure he receives every opportunity to succeed." Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Even kindness could carry judgment. "What stories have you heard?" William's expression grew serious. "I've heard about a woman who chose love over convenience, who built a family from scratch in circumstances that would have defeated many people. I've heard about courage, sacrifice, and the kind of community spirit that makes small towns great." He looked directly at Clara. "I consider it an honor to teach Samuel." The tightness in Clara's chest released, replaced by something warm and hopeful. "There's going to be a community meeting next week to discuss the school's needs," William continued. "I hope you'll both attend. Your input would be valuable." After he left, Clara and Margaret sat in comfortable silence, watching Samuel chase a butterfly across the meadow. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you really mean it?" Clara asked finally. "About staying?" "I mean it," Margaret said firmly. "Boston will survive without me, but Samuel needs his aunt, and I need my family." Clara reached over and took Margaret's hand, the first purely affectionate gesture she'd ever made toward the woman she'd once feared would take everything from her. "Then, welcome home," she said simply. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Samuel abandoned his butterfly chase and ran to them, climbing into Clara's lap with the absolute trust of a child who has never doubted he is loved. The letter that had brought Clara west had promised her a husband and a new life. She'd found neither, and both. The husband existed only in abandoned promises, but the new life spread before her like the vast Colorado sky, full of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. In the distance, the evening train whistled its way toward Denver, carrying other dreamers toward uncertain futures. But Clara was already home.